They abandoned a baby in a sack to die. Then a cowboy heard a tiny voice say, "Mama." The high desert was a godless expanse, a sun-bleached canvas exuding a hollow loneliness, raw grief, and a silence that screamed louder than any gunshot. Caleb Cal Maverick rode through it a ghost on a bone-weary horse. He wasn't going anywhere. He was just going away. Each mile was a failed attempt to outrun the memories that clung to him like alkali dust, the shallow graves, the scent of sickness, and the phantom echo of his own daughter's final feverish cry. His heart was a piece of cold iron in his chest, a fortress he'd built to feel nothing at all. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a thin whimper on the wind almost lost. He followed it to a ravine's edge and saw a discarded canvas sack below. It moved. He held his breath, the iron in his chest cracking, as a tiny, impossible voice whispered from within the sack, a word that would either save him or destroy him completely. Mama. The high desert was a godless expanse, a sun-bleached canvas exuding a hollow loneliness, raw grief, and a silence that screamed louder than any gunshot. Caleb Cal Maverick rode through it a ghost on a bone-weary horse he called Dust. He wasn't going anywhere. He was just going away. Each mile was a failed attempt to outrun the memories that clung to him like alkali dust, the shallow graves dug with his own hands, the scent of sickness on a linen sheet, and the phantom echo of his own daughter's final feverish cry. His heart was a piece of cold iron in his chest, a fortress he'd built long ago to feel nothing at all. He was a man who had forgotten the shape of a smile. Just a little further, old boy. He rasped, his voice a dry crackle that startled even him. Dust just flicked an ear, the only acknowledgement he ever got, or needed. The world had shrunk to this one man, one horse, and an endless, aching emptiness. He'd buried his wife, Sarah. He'd buried little Maggie. The fever had taken them like a thief in the night, leaving him the sole cursed survivor. He was plumb out of reasons. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A thin whimper on the wind so faint he thought it was a coyote pup or a trick of his own fraying mind. He pulled Dust to a halt, the squeak of old leather the only sound for a long moment. He listened. The silence roared back at him. Nothing. He grunted, nudging Dust forward. "Getting spooked by ghosts, Cal," he muttered. But there it was again. Closer this time, higher. A desperate, muffled cry that scraped at the inside of his soul. It wasn't an animal, it was human. He swung down from the saddle, his movements stiff. The sound drew him toward the jagged lip of a dry arroyo, a deep wound in the earth. His eyes scanned the crumbling rock and shadows below. And then, he saw it. A canvas sack, stained dark with something he didn't want to name, discarded like a piece of common trash near a cluster of thorny mesquite. It was impossibly still. A grave marker for a secret. Cal's hand went to the hilt of his knife, a cold, familiar comfort. He slid down the loose scree of the embankment, his boots sending a cascade of pebbles into the oppressive quiet below. As he approached, the smell hit him sour and faintly of death. He braced himself. He'd seen the worst of what men could do to each other in the war, and the worst of what God could do to a family in a sick room. There was nothing left to shock him. He was wrong. He nudged the sack with the toe of his boot. It was heavier than it looked. And then it moved, just a tiny, unmistakable twitch from within. A cold dread, colder than any winter chill, washed over him. He knelt, his heart hammering against the iron wall of his chest. He drew his knife, the blade glinting dully in the merciless sun. Not for a threat, for a mercy. Whatever was inside it was suffering. With a steady hand, he sliced through the rough twine, holding the sack closed, and peeled back the stiff canvas. The stench of sweat and fear rose in a wave, but beneath it was the impossible, undeniable scent of a living thing. Not a wounded animal, not a monster, a baby. She was nestled in a dirty linen wrap, her face blotchy and pale, her lips tinged with blue. But her chest rose and fell in shallow, determined breaths. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fluttered open. They were unfocused, glazed with exhaustion, but they found his face. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The wind died. The sun ceased its scorching. There was only the silent, desperate gaze of a life that should have ended a life that had refused to obey. He reached in his calloused, trembling fingers, brushing against her cheek. Her skin was cool, but it was the warmth of life, not the cold of the grave. The touch shattered something inside him, a fissure in the fortress he'd so carefully built. The baby's lips parted. A tiny gasping sound escaped. And then a single impossible word, a whisper that was not a whisper but a cannon blast in the silence of his soul. Mama. The word hung in the dead air, an echo that tore through 20 years of silence. Mama. For a long moment, Caleb Maverick was no longer a man but a statue carved from grief. The iron fortress in his chest didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces of rust and memory. He saw his wife Sarah's face pale in the lamplight. He saw his daughter Maggie, her small hand in his. The ghosts he'd ridden so hard to escape had finally caught him here in this sun-scorched ditch summoned by a life in a sack. Then the baby coughed, a dry, rattling sound that broke the spell. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. He shed his worn duster, the closest thing to a clean blanket he owned, and gently wrapped the infant. She was impossibly light, a bundle of fragile bones and fierce, unyielding life. He named her Alara in his mind, a name that felt like a star, a speck of light in a universe of darkness. The journey to Hope's End was a waking nightmare. He rode with the reins in his teeth, and Alara cradled against his chest, her shallow breaths a terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He dripped water from his canteen onto his finger and pressed it to her lips, a clumsy sacrament. Hold on, he whispered the words, a prayer he didn't know he still possessed. You just hold on now. Hope's End was a town holding its breath. It wasn't loud and lawless, it was worse. It was quiet. An unnerving, watchful quiet that spoke of a single heavy hand pressing down on everything. As Cal rode down the main street, windows became frames for shadowy faces. Men stopped their conversations, their eyes following him with a cold, flat appraisal. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at the small bundle in his arms. He was a problem. He could feel it in the air. He stopped before the only respectable-looking building in town, a 2-story boarding house with a sign that read, "The Rose Room and Board." A flicker of lavender bloomed in the window boxes, a defiant splash of color in a world of brown dust. He pushed the door open, a small bell chiming his arrival. The woman behind the counter looked up, and for the second time that day, Cal's world tilted. She was not old, her face framed by dark hair, pinned with severe elegance, but her eyes held a strength that could stop a charging bull. This was Seraphina Rose. I need help. Cal managed the words, feeling foreign and brittle on his tongue. Seraphina's gaze was sharp, missing nothing. Not his dusty, trail-worn appearance, not the desperation he tried to hide, and certainly not the duster-wrapped bundle. What kind of trouble are you in, mister? She asked, her voice calm but firm. No fear, just a steady, unnerving competence. He didn't have the words. He simply walked forward and laid Alara on the polished oak counter. He unwrapped the duster. The baby lay there, pale and still, a silent testament to his desperation. Seraphina's professional demeanor melted. A soft gasp escaped her lips. Lord have mercy. In an instant, she was a whirlwind of purpose. Bring her back here. Now. And you, she commanded, pinning Cal with a look. Don't you move a muscle. He watched helpless and useless as she took Alara into a back room. He heard the sounds of water being poured, of soft cloth, of a gentle humming voice. It was the sound of a home, a sound he hadn't heard in a lifetime. It was the purest form of torture. She returned minutes later, her expression a mixture of pity and a new unsettling fear. She's weak, but she's a fighter. Where did you find her? West of here, in a sack, he said, the words tasting like poison. Seraphina's face went pale. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that Cal didn't understand. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. What did the sack look like? Was it canvas stamped with a black bird in the corner? Cal frowned, trying to remember. Yeah, I think so. A crow or a raven. Seraphina closed her eyes, a look of profound dread settling over her. That's the mark of the Kane Mining Company, she breathed. Augustus Kane's mark. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading with him to understand the danger he had just brought through her door. There was a girl, she whispered. Rosalind Fay, she worked for him. She vanished a month ago. People said she left town. Her gaze dropped to the back room where the baby now slept, but she was with child. The name Augustus Kane fell into the quiet room and shattered the fragile peace. It was not a name, it was a weight, a shadow that had already swallowed the town of Hope's End whole. Cal saw it in the way Seraphina's strong hands trembled, in the way the light in her eyes seemed to dim. Hope's End, a bitter joke. This place was the end of hope, and Augustus Kane was its undertaker. That night, Cal did not sleep. Seraphina had found a small wooden cradle, a relic from her own past, and Alara slept within it, a picture of impossible peace. Cal sat in a chair beside her, a shotgun across his lap, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child. The iron wall inside him had been breached, and now the memories flooded in. He saw his Maggie, her small chest rattling with that same terrible rhythm. He remembered his own helplessness, a suffocating blanket of failure. He had been a husband, a father. He had failed. The world had taken everything, and he had let it. But as he watched Alara's tiny hand curl into a fist, something new and hard as diamond formed in the wreckage of his soul. It was not just grief. It was rage. A cold, clean rage that burned away the fog of whiskey and regret. They had left this child to die. They had tried to erase her. He would not let them finish the job. The old Cal Maverick was a ghost. This new man sitting vigil in the dark was a protector. Morning came gray and grim. Seraphina moved about the kitchen, the silence between them thick with unspoken plans. "They will come," she said, her back to him as she poured coffee. She knew neither of them would drink. "I know," Cal replied. "His hounds," she continued, her voice low and tight. "The Griswold brothers. They aren't men, Cal. They're Cain's will, made flesh and blood. They enjoy their work. When Rosalind's own father tried to ask Cain questions, the Griswolds paid him a visit. He hasn't spoken a word since, just sits on his porch and stares at the dust." She turned her face, a mask of grim resolve. "They won't knock politely." She was right. The sound, when it came, was not a knock. It was a heavy, arrogant thud of a boot kicking the front door, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps on the porch. Cal was already moving, pushing Seraphina toward the back room. "Stay with the child," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He grabbed the shotgun. "You can't fight them both," she hissed. "Won't have to," he said. "This isn't a fight, it's a message." He opened the door. Two men stood there, their sheer size blotting out the morning light. They were thick-set and brutish with the same flat, dead eyes of cornered rattlesnakes, the Griswold brothers. The larger one grinned a humorless slash in his bearded face. "Mornin', ma'am," he said, his eyes sliding past Cal to where Seraphina had been. Then his gaze settled on Cal, dripping with contempt. "Heard you found some lost property. Mr. Kane is a man who likes his things returned." "This is a boarding house," Cal said, his voice dangerously calm. The shotgun rested in the crook of his arm, its barrel pointed at the floor, but its presence screaming a warning. "Not a lost and found." "Don't get smart, old man," the second brother sneered. "We ain't here for talk. We're here for the babe. Hand it over, and maybe we won't have to tear this pretty little place apart." They took a step forward. Cal didn't move. He didn't raise the gun. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet, immovable resolve. The air crackled. The street outside had gone utterly silent. The entire town was watching, waiting. "Over my dead body!" Cal said the words soft, but they hit with the force of a hammer blow. The brothers paused. They had expected a frightened old man, not this granite wall of defiance. They exchanged a look. This was more trouble than they'd been paid for this morning. The first one spat a wad of tobacco juice that landed inches from Cal's boot. "Kane gets what he wants," he snarled. "Always. This ain't over." They turned and stomped off the porch, their departure as loud and violent as their arrival. Cal closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of grim finality. The sanctuary had been breached. The message had been delivered. Seraphina emerged from the back, her face pale. She looked at Cal, then at the cradle where Alara still slept oblivious. There were no more words to be said. They both knew. Staying meant death. The time for hiding was over. The time for running had just begun. They fled under a sliver of a moon, ghosts slipping from a town of ghosts. The escape was a silent, frantic symphony of hurried packing and whispered commands. Serafina gathered what she could for Alara Linen's a little milk, a precious bottle of her own lavender water. Cal moved with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for a long campaign taking jerky water and ammunition. He left the shotgun behind. It was too loud, too clumsy. Out there in the rocks and the silence, his Colt and his knife were all the companions he needed. The wilderness that swallowed them was a brutal sanctuary. By day, the sun was a hammer beating down on the cracked earth, forcing them into the scant shade of rock overhangs. By night, the cold was a physical thing, a presence that seeped into their bones. But here, Cal was no longer a stranger in a hostile town. He was a king in his own savage kingdom. The land spoke a language he understood. He found water where there seemed to be none, seeping from the base of a rock face hidden by a curtain of dry weeds. He read the tracks of animals, the shift in the wind. He was a part of this desolation, and it cloaked them, but their pursuers were relentless. On the second morning, as he scouted ahead, he found it. A single, fresh cigar butt, the brand favored by the larger Griswold brother, dropped carelessly near a game trail. They weren't just following, they were close, and they were confident. A cold fury settled in his gut. He didn't tell Serafina. The weight of that knowledge was his to carry alone. He watched her as they rested that afternoon in the deep shadow of a box canyon. She had a strength he had not anticipated. She did not complain. She did not weep. She tended to Alara with a fierce maternal devotion that sent a painful echo through Cal's own shattered past. She was a rose, all right. Not a delicate hothouse flower, but a wild desert rose, beautiful and covered in thorns. She has your eyes. Cal said the word surprising him. He was looking at Alara, but speaking to Serafina. Serafina managed a tired smile. She has Rosalind's spirit. She was a fighter, too. Her smile faded. I should have known she wouldn't just leave. As she rewrapped Alara in a fresh linen, her fingers paused. What's this? She murmured, her brow furrowed. She felt a small, hard object sewn into the thickest part of the swaddling cloth, a lump that was clearly not part of the original design. Cal knelt beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Using the tip of his knife, he carefully sliced the threads. Serafina reached into the small opening and pulled out a small silver locket tarnished by sweat and dust. It was a simple, elegant thing. It swung gently from her fingers on its delicate chain. With a trembling thumb, she pressed the clasp. It sprang open. On one side, intricately engraved, was a name, Rosalind Fay. On the other side, where a portrait should have been, was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, the air thick with anticipation. Cal took the paper, his large, scarred fingers impossibly gentle as he unfolded the brittle note. The handwriting was feminine but jagged, written in a frantic, desperate rush. The ink was faded, blurred in places as if by tears. It wasn't a letter. It was a plea. A final, terrified testament. He knows. Augustus knows. He says a child will ruin him. He offered me money to go away, but his eyes were tombs. He will not let me keep her. He speaks of silence, of making things right for good. If you are reading this, I am already gone. Her name is Alara. Protect my star. Protect her from her father. The note ended there. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind, the cries of the hawks, the sound of their own breathing, it all vanished. Cal looked at Serafina, and he saw his own cold rage reflected in her tear-filled eyes. This was no longer a flight for survival. The ghost of Rosalind Fay had just handed them a declaration of war. The Griswold brothers were not just hunting a baby. They were hunting the last living witness to a murder. And Cal Maverick, a man who had been running from his own ghosts, finally had a reason to stop, turn, and fight. The hunt was about to change directions. The ghost of Rosalind Fay's last words settled between them colder than the high desert night. It was no longer a plea. It was a testament, a weapon forged in terror and grief. Cal Maverick, the man who had been running from his own ghosts, looked at Serafina, and for the first time she saw no trace of the broken wanderer. She saw a soldier. They won't stop hunting, he said, his voice flat and hard as iron, not until Alara's silenced too. What do we do, Cal? Serafina whispered, clutching the sleeping child tighter. He folded the note with a terrible reverence and tucked it inside the silver locket, closing it with a soft final click. A hunt has two sides, he said, his eyes turning toward the dark trail leading back to town. We stop running. We start hunting. He found them a place before dawn, a high hidden alcove in the rocks, a natural fortress that watched the only trail back to Hope's End. It was a place a man could defend. He gave Seraphina the rifle and a small pouch of cartridges. Her hands were steady as she took them. You're not going alone, she stated, not a question. I am, he countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. He looked from her strong, determined face to the peaceful, sleeping infant. I brought this storm to your door, Seraphina. I won't have you or her in the thunder when it breaks. He paused, his hand hovering for a moment over Alara's head. You keep her safe. I'm going to finish this. He didn't wait for a reply. He melted into the pre-dawn shadows, a specter of vengeance moving back the way he came. He was no longer the prey. He was the trap. He found the spot a mile from town, a narrow pass where the trail snaked between two towering rock formations. A bottleneck, a killing ground. He settled himself high above a patient predator of stone and shadow, and waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed, beating on his back. Then he heard it, the crunch of hooves on gravel, the low, coarse laughter of the Griswold brothers. They rode with an arrogant slouch rifles, resting easy in their saddle scabbards, confident their prey was still running scared. Cal raised his Colt, the worn metal cool and familiar in his hand. He let them ride directly into the center of the pass. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He simply whistled a single sharp note that echoed off the canyon walls. The brothers reined in their heads, snapping up in confusion. In that heartbeat of hesitation, Cal fired. The shot was perfect. The larger brother grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face, and tumbled from his horse like a sack of grain. The second brother roared in rage, fumbling for his own pistol, firing blindly up at the rocks. But Cal was already moving, a blur of motion, sliding down a shale embankment to flank him. Before the man could get his bearings, Cal was there. The second shot was just as final. Silence returned to the canyon, broken only by the nervous whinnying of the horses. It was over in less than a minute. Cal stood over the bodies, his face a mask of grim duty. This was not for sport. This was not for glory. This was for a girl named Rosalind and a baby named Alara. He rode into Hope's End as the sun began its long, bloody descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He rode one horse and led the other two, their saddles empty. The message was clear. Doors slammed shut. Faces vanished from windows. The town's oppressive quiet was now a deep, terrified silence. He rode down the center of the street and stopped before the grand two-story office of the Kane Mining Company. He dismounted, letting the reins of the three horses drop into the dust. Kane. Cal's voice was not a shout. It was a command, a raw, powerful sound that carried across the empty street and clawed at every closed door. Augustus Kane, come out and face your sins. The door opened. Augustus Kane stepped onto the porch, flanked by two more hired guns. He was dressed in a fine suit, his face a mask of arrogant fury. Maverick, Kane sneered. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, a fatal mistake. The mistake was yours, Cal said, his voice steady. He held up the silver locket so it caught the last rays of the dying sun. You should have made sure she was dead. He didn't wait for Kane to react. He opened the locket and began to read Rosalind's words, his voice ringing with the clarity of judgment in the dead still air. He speaks of silence. If you are reading this, I am already gone. Protect my star, protect her from her father. A collective gasp rippled through the town from behind the closed curtains. The truth was, out a poison that killed lies. Kane's face contorted, his civilized mask stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. Kill him, he roared to his men. But Cal was waiting for it. His hand was a blur. The Colt was in his fist, barking fire before Kane's men could even clear their holsters. One went down, the other scrambled for cover. Kane, in his rage, made his final mistake. He pulled his own ornate pistol, a gentleman's weapon, against a soldier's fury. Cal fired again. His shot was not for the hired gun. It was for the man who gave the orders. The bullet struck Kane square in the chest, throwing him back against the door of the office he had built on a foundation of greed and murder. He slid to the porch, a look of shocked indignation on his face, his reign of terror over. The last hired gun threw down his weapon. Cal stood in the street, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt, the empty horses of the dead his silent witnesses. The silence of fear was broken by a new sound, a door creaking open, then another. The people of Hope's End were finally stepping out of the shadows. The smoke from Cal's Colt drifted away on the evening breeze, a ghost of righteous violence dissipating into the twilight. For a long moment the world was utterly silent. There was only the dead man on the porch and the living man in the street, surrounded by the empty horses of the fallen. Cal stood not as a victor, but as a man who had walked through the fires of hell and come out the other side, his soul scoured clean by fury. He was empty, exhausted, and for the first time in 2 decades he was not running. The silence was broken by a sound, a single door creaking open. An old man, the one who had not spoken since the Griswolds paid him his visit, stepped out onto his porch. He looked at the body of Augustus Kane, then at Cal. He said nothing, but he slowly, deliberately removed his hat. It was a sign, a crack in the dam of fear. Another door opened, then another. The people of Hope's End emerged from their cages, stepping blinking into the twilight of their newfound freedom. They were ghosts no longer. Then a frantic cry cut through the charged air. Cal! Seraphina! She ran down the street, her face a pale mask of terror and hope, the rifle clutched forgotten in one hand. She didn't stop until she reached him, her eyes searching his face, his chest, for any sign of a wound. She saw he was unharmed, and a ragged sob of pure relief escaped her. She didn't touch him. She didn't have to. In that single shared gaze, a bond was sealed, a promise made and accepted in the space of a heartbeat. Doc Thaddeus was next his face, a roadmap of awe and solemn respect. "You've lanced the Boyle son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as he knelt beside Kane's body, not to render aid but to confirm a death. "You've given this town a chance to heal. They took care of their own." There was no talk of a marshal, no need for a judge from a distant county. Hope's End passed its own judgment that night. The townspeople, moving with a quiet, shared purpose, dealt with the dead. They did not treat Cal as a killer, but as a liberator. He was no longer the outsider, the problem. He was the man who had faced the monster they had all secretly fed with their silence. The seasons turned. The harsh winter snows melted, and the high desert bloomed with a fierce, fragile beauty. Hope's End bloomed with it. The oppressive quiet was replaced by the sound of hammers, not the relentless, soul-crushing drone of Kane's mind, but the rhythmic, hopeful sound of men repairing their own homes, building a new community. The name of the town was no longer an irony. Cal Maverick stayed. He was no longer a drifter, a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he had found. He traded his gun belt for a tool belt. His hands, once so skilled with a Colt, rediscovered the forgotten language of wood and nail. He helped Seraphina expand the boarding house, adding a new porch where the lavender could catch the morning sun. He helped the old man, Rosalind's father, rebuild the fence the Griswolds had broken. He worked from sunup to sundown, and in the labor he found a new kind of peace. The work was honest. It was creation, not destruction. It was a penance and a prayer. His true work, his true salvation, was Alara. She grew from a fragile, silent infant into a bright, curious toddler. She was the heart of the town, a living symbol of their second chance. She learned to walk on the new porch Cal had built, her small hands clutching his calloused finger. She learned to talk, her laughter echoing in the halls of the Rose Room, a sound that chased away the last of the shadows. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land, Cal sat on that porch. Ilara was asleep in his lap, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm, her dark hair the same color as the twilight. Seraphina sat beside him in a rocking chair, her needle and thread still for a moment as she watched them. The silence between them was no longer tense or unspoken. It was a comfortable, living thing. Cal looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse that had once seemed so godless and empty. He thought of Sarah and Maggie. For the first time, the memory did not bring the sharp, familiar stab of guilt. It brought a quiet, aching sweetness. He could almost feel them there, a gentle presence on the breeze, their spirits not haunting him, but watching over him. They were at peace. And so finally was he. "You're quiet tonight," Seraphina said softly. Cal looked down at the sleeping child in his arms, this tiny star that had fallen from the sky and taught him how to live again. He felt a smile touch his lips, a real one, one that reached the tired, grateful corners of his eyes. "Just feeling hopeful," he said. Serafina reached out and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, a promise of a future he never thought he'd have. Together they watched the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon, leaving the sky awash with the brilliant, hopeful colors of a new dawn to come. The lone wolf had found his pack. The wanderer had finally truly come home.